Fantastic. Thank you all for coming and joining us tonight. It is amazing that so many of you have been able to join with us, and many of you for the first time are joining this evening training series that STC puts on. This month, we're going to be learning about what we have called in our local plans economic gardening, working to develop small businesses as a source of economic growth within the region. Della Rucker has been active across the nation for more than 20 years. She's worked specifically with Huntsville, Alabama. She's worked in New Hampshire, in Texas. She's currently working with the US Virgin Islands, and she has worked with the state of Washington. She designed systems for accelerating economic revitalization, growing healthy small businesses, fostering intelligent land use, and creating inclusive public engagement. We are very pleased to have her present with us today. And now I'm going to hand over the hosting duties to her, and we're going to get started.
All right. Now I got to work, huh? All right. All right. Now we're ready to roll. So thank you very much for taking the time to have what I hope will be a good conversation. I'm going to start with a little overview of my perspective on innovation. And innovation, from my experience, is not simply the domain of technologists or PhDs or people with big hats, big fancy hats. But innovation, I would argue, is really the crucible of what we need for small business development, for entrepreneurship development, and for economic growth. And we'll talk about the different ways that we can define economic growth as we go forward. But we're in a moment in history where a lot of the assumptions, a lot of the expectations, and a lot of the sort of basic examples and models of the world that we take for granted are not so relevant anymore. And so a portion of what we're going to be talking about today is going to have to do with unpacking what it is that we've learned from people who preceded us and from the culture of the industrial era, which I think all of us came up in to some extent or another. Understanding that, sort of deconstructing that, and seeing what we can carry forward and how we need to do the work of innovation and really of problem solving in a different manner than we have assumed up to this point. And I'm happy to have, this is a small group, I'm happy to have questions as we go forward. I can't see all of you because I need to be able to see the screen. So if you ask a question, if you use the put your hand up function or something like that, I might not see it. I asked Victoria to sort of verbally tap me on the shoulder if she sees something like that. Otherwise, please feel free to just kind of verbally interrupt as you need to. Okay? So let's get going. So brief introduction. So I'm an urban planner and an economic developer by training. And that's primarily where I know place dynamics from. I have been, I'm both an AICP, which is the American Institute of Certified Planners, and a CECD, which is the Certified Economic Developer. I'm one of very few people in the country who are foolish enough to try to maintain both of those certifications because they don't talk to each other. It's, kind of a handful sometimes, but it's been, I've carried both of those now for a dozen years. And it's extremely important to me because most of the big questions that I have and most of the big things that I'm interested in fall in the sort of the spaces between urban planning and economic development. So I try very hard to keep a foot in both of those worlds, but really be focused on what does the future look like, and what is it that we need to be doing differently going forward, whether that's at the governmental level, the local nonprofit and community development level, or at the business level. As a result of that, I have been on an entrepreneurial journey of my own. I am actually, to my slight bewilderment, now responsible for 3 organizations. I have a company called the Wise Economy Workshop. That's the WE that you see in the corner, and the name you'll see on my email. It's the name I use the most. That's really my consulting, writing, and speaking platform. So I have a micro press through that. I do, that's where I do a lot of the sort of the content and the thought development work that I'm particularly interested in doing. But for me, it's always been important to be thinking and doing. And so the doing side has manifested at this point into 2 different businesses that I'll introduce to you as we go through. One is a business called Trep House. And Trep House is a virtual super hub for what we call new majority founders. New majority is not me. New majority founders, it's a Black-centric culture. It's a Black-led organization. And so we are focused on people who are African-American, Afro-Caribbean, members of the African diaspora, in addition to other underrepresented or under-resourced populations. So that's what the new majority portion means. We also tend to focus on, we're designed for millennial and Gen Z founders. So kind of focus on that emerging end of the spectrum. The virtual super hub part means that we're trying to provide a comprehensive range of resources and do it in an online manner that's accessible to anybody. So that's Trep House. The other one is called Ecology. And Ecology was a bit of a zombie for the last couple of years. So I'm just now starting to talk about Ecology again. And in fact, if you go look for the website, it's not quite working yet. I'm still having problems getting the domain name to fire up again. But Ecology is focused on enabling young people's innovation, particularly working with colleges and universities. And I'll introduce you a little bit more to some of Ecology's work as we go forward. So that's primarily where I am. This picture, just for those of you who are involved in this space, this picture was actually taken at the State of Wisconsin Main Street program national conference a few years ago. So my roots and my sort of my guts really are in the small business space and in the downtown space. I grew up and really cut my teeth in downtown and downtown business revitalization. So that's who you're talking to, because I know it's kind of, random humans showing up out of the universe. Hopefully that gives you a little bit more context on where I'm coming from and gives you a little more resources to interpret what I'm saying today. So roadmap today. I want to talk a little bit about what some of the newest innovators look like, some of these small business, entrepreneurial, highly innovative entities that you're not going to read about in the Wall Street Journal or USA Today or whatever. Because there's some really amazing things that are coming to the surface, and this is going to be nationally. But then we're also going to need to talk about how innovation and entrepreneurship today looks a little bit different from what we learned. We have all learned coming up through our growing up in our careers, especially in the sort of quasi Rust Belt area that encompasses sort of the legacy industry of New York and Pennsylvania and my hometown of Cleveland, Ohio, where we came up with we really had a very strong base in assumptions and expectations about how to do work and how to do new work. And those have gone out the window very dramatically over the last few years. So then we'll talk a little bit about the problems, some of the barriers, some of the structural disconnects between how we do entrepreneurship today and how I think we need to be doing it in order for these people to succeed. And we'll wrap up with a few recommendations. So this is going to be very high level. I'm going to try to do it fairly quickly, but what I want to make sure that we can do is talk about your questions and your ideas as we conclude today. So consider this kind of a framing up for an additional conversation. So as I mentioned, innovators today don't quite look and do like the same as we came up thinking. So I'm going to introduce you to 4 different innovators, 3 of whom I have video of. So I'll show you the video either before or after I talk about them a little bit. The first one, unfortunately, I don't have video because they are good, solid, we put our heads down and we get stuff done. I can't even find pictures, still photographs of the people who are doing the amazing work at Alark Manufacturing. Now, Alark is in Sheboygan, Wisconsin, which is a city of about 50,000. It's about halfway between Milwaukee and Green Bay, Wisconsin. In Wisconsin, they do the hand map. I lived in Wisconsin for 10 years, so this is part of why I can do this. So essentially, if this is Green Bay, Wisconsin, and this is Milwaukee, and down here is Chicago, Sheboygan's kind of right in the middle between those. Alark looks like any other tool and die factory, tool and die manufacturer, fabricator. You can find folks like this certainly all across, the United States. Alark is fascinating from an innovation standpoint for 2 reasons. One of them is that they can literally build, make, or repair anything. You have a paper mill water intake valve that was made 120 years ago, and it is rusted or there's a part that's been bent, they can fix it. If they can't fix it, they can fabricate it from scratch. And that's an amazing thing to be able to do. They're one of very few in the country who can handle that kind of work. Think of the very biggest, heaviest pieces of machinery across the nation. When they get broken or they fail to work or they need just to be cleaned up and fixed up and able to work for another 100 years, Alark is one of the few companies that they send people to. So Alark has, not only do they have all sorts of machinery and technology, but they also have amazing people who just have the skill set and the mindset to create anything. And one of the interesting side benefits to Sheboygan and to Northeast Wisconsin as a result of what Alark can do is that it also allows its employees to work on their side projects within this company, within the company space. So on a Friday evening or a Sunday afternoon, you will find Alark employees in the factory, in the shop, creating all sorts of products that are largely pertaining to, their passions. So creating new devices for, this is going to be very upper Wisconsin thing, for making brats, for home production of brats, beer making, ice fishing, ice boating. They've got folks within the company who are creating all of these kinds of businesses while also providing this very valuable service. And we very often, as economic developers, don't treat quote unquote side businesses or side hustles as anything of value, but they're creating value and they're selling products. And there's a potential there that ALARC and the region are trying to figure out how to tap, which is how do we enable some of these creations to really grow into their full potential and become full-fledged businesses. So that's one example. Let me give you another example that's in a completely different kind of space. So this
is where you think about them.
I'll let you hear her for a minute.
Your house. Now they've entered your home. What do you normally do when a guest come in? I hope you don't ignore them. Talk to them, right? You invite them, give them a glass of water, you sit down with them, and you talk, right? You get to know them.
So this woman completely, she's amazing to me. So Colette Brown is a social media branding manager, strategy advisor. She is in that realm of work, which for a lot of us is a little bit more unfamiliar. She very much lives in that space. She also lives in the US Virgin Islands, which sounds wonderful and exotic, but it also means that there is virtually no infrastructure for her. She can get phone service in most places. She can get internet access in most places. But when she shoots videos like this that are viewed by people all over the world, she has to do it from wherever she can do it. Her home, where she is living with her parents because housing is extremely expensive in the USVI, from hotel lobbies, from wherever she can get. And that's a problem that faces many people who are working in the social media industry. And it is an industry. It is significant money moving through that industry. She is making her living doing that work. She's also working with the Economic Development and Administration of the Virgin Islands. This is an early project to create a space where other content creators like herself can get access to a variety of beautiful backgrounds. You can see here she's against a nice dark wood wall door, but that's not always going to be the most appropriate context for her content. How much more effective would she be if she could get access to, call it 10 spaces, all designed according to different aesthetics, depending on what she wants to talk about. So she's in the process of building that in partnership with the Economic Development and Administration of the US Virgin Islands. And I think that's going to be incredibly catalytic in a few years. People want to go to the USVI. You can only take so many pictures on the beach. They need other places to be generating that content. Again, that's not an industry that any of us knew about before, but someone like Colette lives and breathes that industry. And we'll talk more about why that's so valuable in a minute. So I'm going to show you, I've got two more examples, and I'm going to just show you the videos because I think in both cases, these videos tell the story. So this first one actually comes from my company, Ecology, and it's going to introduce you to one of the ways that we have worked on unlocking young people's innovative capability and putting it to work for themselves and for businesses. And I'll let the folks, you're going to hear me first, and I cringe a little bit every time I hear the introduction to this video. But I think what the student development team and the company have to say, the company CEO, I think are pretty valuable. I will note that the products that you see designed in this video were done by a team on which nobody was over the age of 25 years old. Link Consulting connects talented students looking for real-world experience to businesses that need professional results.
BTG Labs is a surface science company. If you are a company that paints or prints or coats or glues, and you have problems with a surface holding the paint or the glue, you need to measure that surface cleanliness, and we have an instrument that you very fast, quick, and easily and accurately can determine within 2 seconds whether the surface is ready to be painted or glued.
This is the old one. It's not very pretty. It's a little difficult to use.
It's too big for most people's hands. The screen is this like soft touch material that doesn't really work very well.
The students working on BTG had a continuous relationship with the client. From the beginning to the end, we were constantly reaching out to the client to check on our progress, to make sure that the results that students were putting together matched what the client was looking for. And it also is a big benefit to the client, who typically appreciates being close to the students, meeting the students, learning what the students are learning from the project.
Having worked with University of Chicago, Wharton, student groups from those that do project, and being disappointed. In those cases, it wasn't a program. You went in with a business problem and you asked them to fix it, and you got various degrees of satisfaction in your results. Here with Della and Owen, you had two experienced business people that really had a better grasp of what we were looking for. So it wasn't, here's a simple problem, we'll give you a study and answer it. It was, we have a lot of assets at our disposal. We've got business students, we've got designers, we've got faculty at DAP, we've got faculty at Xavier. We have Xavier professors who are pricing experts. So you're going to be working with students, but they're going to be guided by faculty, and then also with the help of Della and Owen, driving the process through, and just felt confident that if we were going to pay them the money to do this project, they were going to deliver the results.
I feel we've helped BTG a lot personally. On the business side, we made an entire pricing model for them, segmented their entire customer base, helped them with the sales team pitch, marketing tactics. I mean, pretty much an overall complete business package. On the design side, they have a brand new product. I mean, literally 6 students made an entirely new product for BTG.
I'm definitely a better industrial designer than I was even a month ago.
I personally think that this has been one of the best decisions I've made, purely because I've learned more from this than taking any class that I've taken.
I definitely got more out of Ecology and X-Link than I would have gotten out of a traditional firm. I feel like a lot of traditional firms are basically, you're an intern and they're babysitting you. Usually you're being babysat to do design work. This is even more than that. I'm being managed rather than babysat.
It was very worth it. And I mean, the key was the product at the end was a very nicely delivered product, and it's everything we wanted it to be. So it was more than just a good experience and working with college students and trying to help them grow. We came out ahead because we have a really nice design for our next products.
So that is, come on, let's escape. All right, so going back to presenting, I'm still sharing and hitting all the wrong buttons, which is kind of par for the course here. So by the way, Mark, who was one of the students who was talking in that, we had to shoot that like 4 times because that was actually Mark slowed down compared to what he usually sounds like. So I was literally standing behind the cameraman going like this the whole time. And that's what we got. But the enthusiasm, you know, the impact was impressive. And it was an impact. It was an innovation that was coming from people that nobody expected would be able to produce an innovation like that. So the final one I want to show you is I am going to have to escape out of this and go to a tag. This company is addressing a very significant direct problem that we're all facing, which is affordable housing. And they're doing it from a completely new perspective.
Materials Rising, a local entrepreneur and his team are on a mission to make housing more affordable.
I need to move this and make this bigger.
So
a trend really catching on all across the country. The team just securing property concepts. It's this week's Tell Me Good News. Sorry, this team are thinking
as a futurist and as a generalist, and so just like generally looking at the market and where it's headed.
With over a decade of real estate investing, Chemo securing this building on West 3rd Street in West Dayton with a vision and its sights set on development, providing an option to help people who can't afford buying or renting a home.
You know, I realized the trend was leaning towards modular prefab type of building.
In other words, think building a home like Legos, using shipping containers, just like the pictures you see here. The homes constructed in a warehouse that delivered on site. Chemo says it'd be a great option for a first-time home buyer that has the ability to grow with a person throughout their life.
And as you meet your significant other, if you decide you want to start a family, maybe they also own one of our smaller units. You can combine the two, add a couple more, have a couple bedrooms and bathrooms to accommodate the growing family.
The sections of the home will be pieced together in this warehouse. The model homes and concepts will be lined out in the field behind it. Though some of these designs are quite trendy and frankly pretty cool, Chemo is hoping to tackle a much larger problem in his hometown of West Dayton. A mission he hopes has a ripple effect for years to come, making this company designed to build a cooperative organization where the community shapes its future.
So it was like, you know, what would it look like if the community were actually the ones kind of leading the decision making and how we go about developing the communities in which we live in, where they are actually, you know, some of the biggest stakeholders in that decision versus an afterthought once, you know, the ink is already dry.
Chemo says homes can start as low as $50,000 depending on square footage. Now that they have the space to work, construction will soon begin.
We'll be launching with a 3-bedroom, 2-bathroom, 720 square foot model as our lead initially, and then we'll roll out others as we get, you know, our feet under us a little bit better.
Pretty cool, right? Once you get one.
Very cool. I might be interested.
My favorite part is like it's like as your family grows, you just add on to it. That's
I
my
like
favorite
that.
part.
Yeah, he might have one shoe.
So let me,
You can put them together. I
Oops.
thought that was interesting.
Yeah.
so let me escape out of that and go back to the presentation. So by the way, just shameless plug, Design to Build is doing a crowdfund campaign for to raise capital for some of the equipment that they need. There's a couple $1 million in orders lined up. And the crowdfund is for basically it's a return on investment of about 7%. So if anybody's interested in that, it's you can ask me later. I'm happy to give you the link to that. And let's go back to presenting. So there's 4 examples of innovation that is impactful, but under the radar. And my premise to you is that this is what we need more and more and more of, whether we're talking about just for the sake of our own small towns, or if we're talking about the future of how to solve very thorny problems like affordable housing. So we've had a lot of change in how we do, in how innovation functions. And I want to spend a minute just kind of laying out a broad picture of that. By the way, this presentation I will make available. So there's a lot of text that I won't read, but I'll make sure that this is available for everybody as soon as we're done. So we're coming out of a significant era in human history, the industrial era. A lot of people will define that as having started in the early 19th century. I would define that as ending, or at least beginning to end, in the early 1980s, when my hometown, as well as much of the Finger Lakes region, experienced kind of the first collapse of this industrial era. How did industrial era businesses work? What was that model? Well, we went for scale. We defined things very carefully. You're either an engineer or you're an accountant or you're a line worker, and there's no fuzz between. We focused very heavily on hierarchy and fitting into the machinery to do what you're told. And we said that the people who would create the new ideas, we held up people like Ford and Edison to be our sort of our icons. I would put Steve Jobs in that same category, even though it's a modern, a quote unquote modern technology. The way we treat Steve Jobs in sort of our hagiography looks a lot like how previous generations regarded Edison and Ford and Tesla and Kettering and folks of that type. The point being that you've got to be a genius and you've got to be implicitly a white male to be the one who creates the next big idea. The world we live in is increasingly not that way anymore. And again, I'm glossing things at a very high level here. Even large businesses now are dependent on an ecosystem. I work, one of the dominant companies in my city that I live in now, Cincinnati, is Procter & Gamble. Procter & Gamble outsources almost all of its manufacturing. Only in a few industries does Procter & Gamble still own factories. For the most part, a great deal of the work that they do is outsourced to suppliers. And that's because there is an efficiency there for them in the modern era that's a completely different efficiency from what Nelson Rockefeller had when he decided to build his industrial empire all the way from iron ore to the output of products from his steel mills. So it's a very different ecosystem at the global level, but also at the national level. Very few small businesses have all their services in-house. They contract out to others for things like accounting or bookkeeping. And the ways we work together are very different from what we used to see. I want to really focus on this question of anybody can innovate. So in the videos that you just saw, Colette has a degree that has nothing to do with the work that she's doing today. Kamo, the CEO of Design to Build, does not have a degree at all. He has he has an associate's degree, but has had very little education beyond the high school level. Because of the internet, because of social media, that playing field is not leveled, and that's especially when it comes to the money to get things to work, but it's a whole lot different than it used to be. And as we think about our economy, we don't just assume anymore, or we shouldn't assume, that the point of what we're doing particularly in economic development should be about growing, about building something new, creating something new. One of the most valuable innovations that we can do in a lot of communities is to simply plug the leakages in our local economy to prevent money from exiting our community, but instead allow it to recirculate within our community. And that shows up as growth. It's a different kind of growth from recruiting, a new big factory, but it's a very, very valuable kind of growth. And more communities are realizing the importance of that. So there's a lot of work in traditional innovation that doesn't seem to work very well anymore. I have a hard time finding innovation programs that really make the holistic impact on the community. I mean, in terms of local GDP, local wealth, local equitable wealth, because I would argue we're coming at it from the wrong set of assumptions. A lot of times we don't even seriously evaluate what our goals for for our economic development or innovation or entrepreneurship work are. And because of that, we end up focused on the wrong thing. We put all of our money into business recruitment, and we put a minimal amount into growing locally. That's a misalignment of priorities. We're still operating on this very exclusionary approach. We often treat the cowboy fallacy is a sense that we're treating all the entrepreneurs. We just assume that they're cowboys, that they can go off and do their own thing and be fully self-sustaining. I had a community development director years ago who used to say, entrepreneurs are like cockroaches. You just have to put the food out for them and they will come and find it and figure out what to do with it. And that may be correct for people who have a lot of resources and have a lot of information themselves. But for a lot of our communities, they need much more than just a pile of things to pick from. 9 times out of 10, what we have given our local entrepreneurs is a pile of things to pick from instead of a system that helps them not only to launch, but to grow. So how do we turbocharge what we're doing? One thing that I see consistently, big cities, small cities, regional agencies, the entire territory of the US Virgin Islands, is that we say entrepreneurship and innovation, oh, these are so important, so important, so important, but we put a pittance into them compared to what we put into going to conferences, to make a big show at the International Shopping Center's annual conference, wine and dine potential big business recruitments, do FAM tours and site tours. We say this work is important, but very often where we put our money and where we say our priorities are don't line up. And there can be reasons for that. I'm just saying that as a whole, that's a significant issue. But that also doesn't mean that we need to try to be in the business of picking the winners. Colette and Chemo, just for 2 examples, as well as the things that the gentlemen at ALARC are working on, those are spaces that aren't ever going to show up on a cluster analysis, on a professionally developed report that says this is where your growth potential is. Instead, they're things that really kind of came out of left field that these folks knew about and understood. And those opportunities don't unlock unless those people can do that, which is why a very important piece to me is to focus on what I call unexpected innovators, those people who aren't the heirs apparent to Edison and Ford and Elon Musk and whoever, but are the people whose lived experience has been very different from, that kind of upper class, predominantly white elite. Because I have found over and over and over again that these are people who see, who perceive, and who put together insights and opportunities and figure out ways to solve problems, which is really what we're after here, that someone like me would have never come up with. I would have never come up with the idea that Colette has to create this content generation hub, because I don't live in that space. I don't do that work. I don't know what that requires. Chemo understood the need for affordable housing because of his work rehabilitating and flipping houses in a very disadvantaged community, and knowing that they needed faster and more efficient and more disaster resilient ways to house people. So they're crucial, but that population also needs culture, needs a system of support around it, more so than any other kind of entrepreneur. And culture is another one of those things that we've gotten very good at talking about, and not always very good at doing. And that's one of our big challenges as we build out Trep House, is how do we create a culture where our entrepreneurs can say, not only do I have the information and the resources and the technical access that I need to achieve the innovation that I perceive, but I also have a people around me who get it. And we're not used to thinking about that sort of socio-emotional side of the work of entrepreneurship. But especially if we want to unlock those unexpected innovators, creating a culture where they really feel like they can be themselves, they've got people who understand them, there are voices saying to them, you can do it, instead of the voices that they're hearing back home, often from their families, saying, you're an idiot, why are you doing this? Go get a normal job like everybody else. Why are you jeopardizing yourself? And we can get more into that if you want. And then I got to this a little bit before. When we try to support entrepreneurs, small business owners, and innovators, very often we have sort of a scattering of resources. There's an accelerated program over here, and this organization has a little grant, and that organization does pop-up storefronts, and somebody else does something else. But it's very difficult for that person who is the innovator, who is typically very stressed and very overwhelmed. It's very difficult for that person to navigate and figure out where can I get the help that I need? And as a result of that, a lot of them give up. And they either do the best they can with what they have, or they give up on their innovation completely and, go to work for whatever they can do to pay the bills. So creating consistent support systems becomes an increasingly important piece, especially if we want people to be able to do more than just replace their job. There's no reason why a Black entrepreneur, a disabled entrepreneur, anyone can't create a business that employs people and builds wealth. But very often, because there's no support system for that, they get to the point where they're replacing their work, their income that they would have had working for someone else, and they think that's as far as they can go. So we need those continuums. So final pitch, final slide. We need this stuff. We've needed this for a long time. I actually started talking about this back in the early 2000s. We've never needed it more. And I used to say that we needed it because of the downward trend on this chart. So this is jobs created by establishments. The chart for establishments creation looks very similar. And we've had a generations long decline in new business creation. That has started to turn around. It started to turn around in the early 2010s, and then it dipped harder. And then we saw a very significant spike in the last couple of years. But that's folks who are still needing everything that I've talked about to date. So we've got a great opportunity right now with so many people coming into entrepreneurship. What we need more than anything is to put the resources around them to create the problem solving, the innovation, the entrepreneurship that we need moving forward into the future. So that's a whole lot in a very short package. And we've got about 15 minutes left, I believe. Victoria, do you want to take it over? Nobody appeared to think they could get a word in edgewise on me. So I'm hoping folks have questions now.
If you can stay the presenter, then you might be able to move back and forth in the presentation. I enjoyed the jobs created by businesses less than 1 year old chart. And I have questions about regulatory environment.
Sure.
This chart says to me, businesses are highly regulated, and the incentive for starting a new business relative to the cost and the risk was quite high following the Great Recession. And that some of those incentives may have changed in the time of social media. Now that people are doing all this work from home, do you find that that's true? Are there any other incentives or deregulatory approaches that our local governments could take that might inspire additional growth and generation of new businesses?
So the regulatory piece obviously is extremely important. The interesting thing with the regulatory piece is that it is a very different factor from one place to another, certainly from one state to another, but even from one city to another. So again, I'll use an example. I'll use two examples that are close to me right now. One is the state of Nevada. So I've done a fair amount of work with what used to be called the downtown project in Las Vegas, which was a innovation strategy for revitalizing the downtown area. For most kind of businesses that are not casinos in Nevada, regulatory barriers are pretty minimal by and large. In Ohio, to get an LLC is $95, which is a barrier for some people, but it's a relatively low barrier compared to, say, the US Virgin Islands, where, as I've been working with them, I learned that the whole process of getting a business started takes a couple $1,000s because of the regulatory requirements that they have. So just like traditional economic development incentives don't, so we know from tradition, let me say it this way. We know traditional economic development incentives don't make a place that was previously completely undoable for a given business suddenly make it magically perfect for them. They don't have that much impact. They can sway a little bit based on kind of the edges of the economic analysis, but for the most part, they don't drive a location decision the way workforce or commuting patterns or land availability or something like that does. Similarly with regulations, they can be a barrier, but for the majority of places, and again, I don't know if this is specific to, I don't know the specifics of your environment, they do this. They change the trajectory a little bit. They don't necessarily change the trajectory enormously. But the supplement onto that is any kind of those little frictions, if you think economically. So a friction being a thing that makes it harder or more expensive to do something. If I'm coming from a place where I've got lots of people who can help me, I've got, deep pockets myself, I've got good savings, I've got, grandma that I can get a loan from because she's fine financially, then that friction may be pretty little. But if I'm someone like Kamo, who has no generational wealth, has nobody in his family who has deep pockets, and because he's been having to make life work for himself under pretty adverse circumstances, doesn't have deep pockets himself, those little frictions can be a lot bigger, So a lot of it is looking at the regulations in the context of who you're working with. But there's, I think, a lot of other things that governments and quasi-governmental agencies can do to help that don't necessarily lie in the regulatory space.
So I have a question.
Yes, sir.
Would you encourage communities to like establish incubator projects for people who want to start businesses?
An incubator is, so if you think about that continuum that I showed in the last slide.
Right.
So there was a picture of a kind of a spiral staircase of books. An incubator or an accelerator, which are, there are two different kinds of programs. One tends to be more physically, like it's here. An accelerator is typically more like a training kind of thing. Those are steps. Those are some of the potential steps that can be in that process. An incubator or an accelerator can be very helpful in certain environments. So for example, if you're in a community that has a lot of people who are really good at making stuff, Alarc in the description that I gave of them is kind of working like an incubator for some of these kind of nascent ideas, because they can go there and they can, they can use the lift, they can use the pneumatic drill, they can use the equipment. Similarly, we see maker spaces. There's a fabulous example in Allentown, Pennsylvania. So if you want to do a road trip, Allentown would be a really interesting place to look at. They actually have a maker space that is helping to launch companies based on just the technological know-how and the making capability of a population that used to build trucks on an assembly line.
Yeah, well, the reason I asked based on what you said is, Victoria, doesn't Corning have an incubator system? And we're trying to expand it into Chemung County that does all the things that were talked about in this for a wide variety of businesses and potential people. Like, I think they're handling about 60 people right now, aren't they?
Well, the incubator project that we're talking about, you're touching extremely briefly on it. What this project is that I have an idea. I'm able to drop into this system, and this system puts me in a position to organize my ideas, to help me educate myself on whether it's a good idea or a bad idea. It puts me in a position where I deal with an accountant that puts me in a budget situation. It puts me in touch with a bank situation. It puts me in touch with a marketing person. So I can take my idea and go from point A to point B in about 10 to 12 weeks.
Good.
If it's done right, it spits me out at the end and I develop a small business. And the key thing is it's a system of every integral part of an entrepreneurial position that maybe I don't have the education in every area, but it puts me in a position of success, and it gets me in a position where I decide or not decide whether it's a good idea at the end of the trip, and spits me out into an organized business.
I did find Incubator Works online, so I've got a little bit of a picture now of what you're talking about, and yeah, I understand what you're saying with regard to Incubator Works, and organizations like that can be very, very effective. I do think pretty much everybody should have one. Some of them are more effective than others. Sure. And the question of that effectiveness is really whether they build that continuum. One of the things that, and you identified this beautifully with the gentleman with the food truck, is that the willingness to work hard and to be diligent and to have what we sometimes call grit. There's plenty of that out there. But very often, those people, especially if they're coming from a less privileged background, they don't get access to that network of the right people and the right information. That becomes a really difficult fight for a lot of these folks. So the more that, like the kind of work that you did with that gentleman, helping him figure out his plan and how to get on his feet and how to make it go, that's really crucial. Sometimes we call it coaching. Sometimes we call it mentoring. What you did sounds more like coaching. And coaching almost always in these kinds of formalized programs gets short shrift. And that's unfortunate because these folks, you know, the folks that have that grit and that determination, they need something more than here's a class and a book and go figure it out, which is a different experience than, you know, a lot of us on this call. And I personally think we miss a ton of opportunities because that coaching that you did doesn't happen.
Well, the
Because
other
the
thing
folks are
too
out
is,
there who'll do it.
but the other thing too is this, is that, you know, I've been downsized myself twice. I had no income in my family.
Yeah.
The whole, I mean, you know, the whole deal. I've gone through the whole 9 yards. I created a landscape business because I had to put food on the table.
Yep.
No one cared about me. Okay. Now I'm saying this for a reason, because I said when I became successful, I would help other people. However, the challenge is this, is sooner or later, you have to understand, you have to help yourself. You have to take responsibility to help yourself. I don't care how down in the dumps you are. I've been there. You've got to help yourself. You got to take responsibility for yourself. We can't always just hold your hand forever. You have to sooner or later help yourself. And that's where people don't. Once they get taken care of, they always expect to be taken care of. You can't do that. This gentleman, the bank wouldn't give him money. No one would give him money. So I put the deal together. He now runs a business himself.
Yep.
Okay.
So it looks like
but I don't
Julie
want to
has a
belabor, I
question
don't
that
want to
she'd like
belabor
to
this.
ask.
I mean, Victoria, I'm available anytime you want to talk. I don't want to take up all your time. I'm traveling tomorrow and I got to get moving. So I apologize for getting emotional, but you know, I'm just looking for someone to listen to me.
Okay.
You notice Vinny left, so he got mad at me. He got mad. He says, Mark, you got to calm down.
I'm down.
Okay,
Calm down.
see, but anyways.
So
Awesome.
Julie, would you like to add something?
Thank you.
Yes. So I am, first of all, I enjoyed listening to you, Vincent. That was very interesting and very informative and also on point. My question is this. I am the chairman of the planning board in the town of Urbana, and we are beginning to review our comprehensive plan. And I would love to get your opinion. I came here from McKinney, Texas, which did a great job of, and I was on city council there and part of the redevelopment of the whole downtown historic square. So I understand, and they've done a great job because they have an economic development corporation. The town of Urbana doesn't have that. But what we do have is a lot of land and a lot of spirit and a lot of buildings. And so I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on how a small rural upstate New York community utilizes their comprehensive plan to encourage entrepreneurship and innovation and perhaps adaptive reuse of historic existing buildings.
Absolutely.
And more importantly, how do you get buy-in from the property owners for this so that we can develop properly? And I also believe that and know that tourism is very good economic development. And there's a lot of things that means and a lot of opportunity for entrepreneurship. So I'm going to mute myself, but that's my question. I'd love to sort of see how we can utilize the resources that we have that aren't money to encourage innovation and attract entrepreneurs to a really wonderful area of upstate New York.
Wonderful.
I
Yeah.
have a very similar note on my page here that we need to figure out a way to work with the asset holders, people who do already own those large, buildings, either industrial or sometimes a repurposed governmental or civic building that maybe isn't currently being utilized for any purpose right now.
Sure. And we have more and more of that existing underutilized space, with the way retail has changed, with the way office work has changed. And again, so you know, I can't say that and the town was Urbana. Is that correct?
Yeah,
Yes.
it's the town of Urbana, and we're at the and it acts as sort of a donut around the village of Hammondsport.
Okay.
And we're at the foot of Cuca Lake, and we're a very vibrant community. Not large, but our biggest asset, besides our wine industry and is that we have an opportunity with our comprehensive plan that that's about 25 years old, that the planning board has been looking at and working with the zoning officer here to sort of see how we can best move it forward in a positive way that retains what the old guard would like, but also encourages new development in a positive way that is in keeping with our mission of our community. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah. So one of the things that often surprises people about retail, and again, I'm speaking in very broad generalities here, there's exceptions to every rule, is that most small town realtors, most small town retailers very often are deriving more of their income today from online sales than they may be from in person. And what that ends up meaning very often is that existing storefronts are sometimes too big for the newest entrepreneurs. It's just too much space if it's being rented at a high rate. It may put them out of the real estate market, which often happens in very demand-driven environments. So from a tourism and an economic development point of view, you really want to have these new, interesting, creative, one-of-a-kind kind of storefronts, but the combination of square footage and cost per square feet can be in a community that's doing well, can be pushing those folks out of the environment. So sometimes in zoning regulations, you've got some, and again, obviously, part of what you do with a comp plan is you're laying the groundwork for future changes to zoning, enabling smaller, more flexible store spaces, making sure that the zoning permits a storefront and a fabrication space where appropriate, assembly space for putting together products or being able to send out products. Sometimes zoning regulations that are written in a very strict manner will prevent those kinds of flexible uses. So that's a big one to look at for existing spaces, especially historic storefronts.
Some of our local laws call that like ultralight industrial or cottage industry.
Okay, cool.
So that would be the kind of language that you would put into the zoning law if you're going to allow, say you had a two-front storefront building that's selling windows. They can't actually sell enough windows to operate that space. They'd need to be manufacturing something in that space. So is it, wood carving, engraving, window manufacturing, but that's not a harmful kind of manufacturing. It's not going to generate smells. It's not going to drive a tremendous amount of traffic or vibration, but it could operate in a downtown business setting and help offset the cost of rent.
And that can be their own business, or it can be a sublease. Again, you start to run into issues as to whether subleases are permitted. There's a really good organization called the Urban Manufacturing Alliance, which is a relatively new startup. The woman who runs it is named Ileana Prus. I believe she's in New York City or thereabouts, so she's within striking distance. That might be an interesting one to talk about, specifically when it comes to crafts, maker spaces, cottage industry, fabrication kind of things. The other question that you raised with regard to landlords, that's a $64,000 question a lot of times, right? Julie, can I ask you whether your landlords, especially whether your landlords tend to be local owners or absentee?
So most of our landowners are local. And we have done, with short-term rentals, we've done a good job of putting into place some zoning, or actually our town code already put something in that really does limit the amount of out-of-town ownership. Because I believe that from what we've seen happening here is a bit destructive when you have a lot of empty buildings, whether they're homes or cottages or apartments or whatever, and nobody around at certain times to take care of those. So we have followed in the lead of some of our other neighbors like Ithaca and taking a look at what Buffalo has done. And we went through, we have an amazing zoning officer, and he was able to help us craft find the language that was already crafted. So most of the people, the problem that I guess I would say we have is the same problem that we had in McKinney, Texas, about 30 years ago, when you had a few people that owned a lot.
Yes.
And so in McKinney, what happened is a few people, they aged out of their ownership, and their descendants passed it on to multiple people. Now, downtown McKinney, incredibly vibrant. The whole area is very vibrant.
Yeah, it's a beautiful town.
Yeah, each of those buildings pretty much is owned by somebody separately. But I'm just wondering, and I think this is something that would be very helpful to just talk about in general with a lot of other communities, is how do we, not only with retail, but with land use, set up something where we encourage an entrepreneur like the fellow that is making the lower income housing out of these very cool containers. What do we do to encourage that kind of someone wanting to come in and do that? And then obviously employ people in our community, because I do believe land use can also, done properly and with community acceptance, can create economic development in a different way than most municipalities tend to think they can create economic development.
Yeah,
I think that's my thought.
So one of the most important things, money greases a lot of wheels, right? Money, once you start putting money into a situation, you start to know what people's real tune is. So we've seen situations, again, this is a retail example, so, but it's a matter of scale to apply it to something like a light manufacturer like Design to Build. But we've seen municipalities or economic development agencies support short-term, provide support for renting a space for a short term. That might be partial support. That might be a short time period, but basically something to sort of get everybody off of ground zero and jumpstart the relationship. Again, that's money. Money can be difficult to come by, or money can be easy to come by. It depends on the context and the environment. That's been one of the pieces that I think I've seen most effective in getting landlords, especially landlords who've inherited a property and thus don't have a mortgage to pay on it, getting them off of ground zero. Because if I can make a little money off of it, but I have to put in a ton of work to get it up to snuff, then I might not want to do that. But if there's a significant incentive for me as the business, as the property owner, to kick in for that, to to participate, then it's a little bit of a different equation. That's really been the one thing that I've seen that's been most effective. The stick side of, if you think about that as the carrot, the stick side is, you know, property maintenance or prohibitions against certain signs of a property being vacant, where you make it uncomfortable for them to just leave the property without any improvement. Does that kind of make sense?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you.
Sure. The other thing, it's worth keeping in mind, I know we tend a lot of times to sort of look at our situation as sort of woe is me. Why would anybody want to, we've got to make it easy for people to be part of our community. That's not necessarily the case. I think we, in what you indicated about the limitations on property owners, absentee property owners, indicates that you've got communities that are understanding that we have something that's worthwhile and we have a value that's worth maintaining. So that's a good angle to lean into when it comes to the public policy side of strengthening restrictions on commercial property owners.
Can you speak for a moment about how a community might pitch that? Because we understand that having a vacant, underutilized building is detrimental to the community, and people understand applying the stick of code enforcement or zoning regulations to properties. But going out and offering renovation assistance to someone who just inherited a building doesn't always feel appropriate. So is there some pitch that you have that has better traction?
Yeah, I think one of the practical pitches is, what do you want for the future of your community? Is just to be very pragmatic about it. Do you want the kind of small business, the kind of entrepreneurship, the kind of whatever that business can, that physical space is set up to support? If you want that, then do you really, you know, then the cost becomes, do you wait around and just wait until that person decides for whatever reason to play ball? Or do you sweeten the pot a little bit? The other thing is that a lot of times, especially when you're dealing with people who've inherited property, they don't necessarily have a lot of, they may not know what they're getting into, right? And that may mean that they need help, or they would benefit from help, just understanding, you know, what are my loan options? I think a lot of times, sometimes those property owners just do nothing because they can do nothing and make money off of it. But sometimes they do nothing because they don't know how or where to go forward. So it kind of depends on the situation and the context. But I think it really comes down to how proactive, how much appetite for being proactive does a given community have.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Is there anybody, you know, from Chemung or Skylar or Steuben who has some more questions? Or do we think we've reached the end?
Y'all need to all go have dinner at some point, don't you? Do you say dinner or supper in that part of New York?
We eat dinner.
Okay. Just curious.
So thank you all so very much for attending. Thank you for your questions. Thank you for sharing so much with us today.
Yeah, absolutely. Victoria, I'll send you, it'll probably, I've got some obligations this evening. I'll send you the deck tomorrow morning. The deck does include my contact information, and it includes contact information for the innovator examples that I showed. The contact for Alaric is weak because that's supposed to be a little quiet, but I wanted you guys to know about it. If somebody wants to talk to Alaric, I'll have to make that introduction directly. But I'm happy to do that. They're good people.
Okay, thank you so much.
All right.
Have a
Take care,
great day,
folks.
everyone.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for having me. I appreciate it.